Now, question. What's wrong with that question?
It's got a line through it.
Well, the original. Yes. That's good advanced technology. Yeah. What's wrong with it is that, of course, it's a leading question. Why are there so many? It's like the traditional leading question: when did you stop beating your wife? And I want to examine that as a leading question in a moment, but we could equally ask, why are there so few species of snail or kinds of snail? Because there are 150 terrestrial species of snail and slug in Britain. There are 24,000 species of insect, and indeed there are 4,000 species of beetles, 7,000 species of flies. So we might equally, why are we so depauperate? Why have we got so few snails and slugs in this country? We ought surely to have far more. Now, why didn't I ask a neutral question? There's a history to that, which I want to explore. I should say that I gave a version of this talk to very professional people a while ago, and they will be familiar with something which you may not have come across. My title imitated the title of an absolutely famous classic paper in theoretical ecology by George Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a Brit who emigrated to the States, and he called it Homage to Santa Rosalia, or Why Are There So Many Kinds of Animals? And he was no idiot, he knew perfectly well that it was a leading question. You might, but on the other hand, if you ask the specific question, well, why are there just this many species here? You get bogged down in a whole lot of individual case histories. And he was after the big generalizations. And so the better question is, what determines the number of species that you get in a particular area? An area can be from large to very small indeed. And at the back of his mind was the idea, which I'm sure you are familiar with, that species of animal that were similar to one another might compete. And therefore, you might not expect to find a whole lot of very similar species living together because they would be competing for the same niche. And theory says one or other of them will end up being the victor, outbreeding all the others. There's another thing wrong with that question. And he used the word kind. Now, if I say, what kind of snail is that? You would usually immediately think of species. How many species have we got in? How many species have we got in this nature reserve or whatever? But species are, if you like, the currency that we use in public. How many species have you got in the site? And it's used in biodiversity studies, it's used in conservation studies to identify hotspots, it's used in ecology, and it's used in biogeography, where the number of species found on a particular island compared to another island has provoked a huge range of debate. It's like money. Species act like a currency. So, for example, you can have one of these for the same price as 28 of these. Completely different chalk and cheese, but when we're looking at statistics, we reduce them all to money. And we talk about value. And I've spent an awful lot of my life talking to other professionals, trying to persuade them that it isn't enough to simply count the species. Because, as I've put rather dramatically there, one kind of species has a very different kind of ecology and distribution to another. So simply tossing them up, as people do in island biogeography, is simply not an acceptable way to go. And so the first point I would make is that which species matter just as much as how many species. Do each of them have their own particular niche, their own particular way of life, which distinguishes them from others? In other words, can competition occur so that species, as it were, have to be spaced out over the available resources in whatever way? Well, at the level that most of us do surveys in, a nature reserve or a patch or something, we're pretty confident about equating kinds with species. We can tell the species apart. They're all living together. We toss up the numbers. Even when we look at our own woodlands and habitats in Britain, we find pairs of species which are remarkably similar to one another coexisting, not always coexisting, but coexisting quite often. So I mentioned Corichium minimum and tridentatum, Copticopa and Lubricella, and the two species of Sapir that we have. And when somebody a long time ago looked at their diets are virtually identical. So that raises doubts in one's mind about just what role competition is playing. But in general, we have no trouble identifying species from a small area and thinking of them as though they were kinds. But it raises the question, particularly when you consider how many insects there are by comparison, are all niches filled in a given place? And what limits the range of particular species or kinds? And particularly in the context of Britain and Northern Europe, what effects of climate change, and I'm talking about glaciations and so on, rather than just what's happening now, and powers of dispersal over areas which were, until the last few thousand years, uninhabitable. Now, the trouble is that when you change the scale, when you start looking at larger areas or different parts of the world, the whole thing descends, as far as I can see, into a kind of mush. So, for example, we have 150, roughly, land slugs and snails. That's about 0.6% of the known global fauna. And actually, given the rate of discovery, it's actually probably more like 0.3% of the global known fauna. Then I go to Greece, smaller country than Britain by quite a bit. There are 750 species of land slug and snail, at least. But when you go look at small sites in Greece, you find usually fewer species than you would find in Britain. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff about whether you're looking at the right habitats and whatnot, but as a general rule, when you look at Mediterranean faunas, the fauna you get in a small area, say a hectare or less, is less than you would find in good spots in Britain. Quite a lot less. And in fact, in our country, the richest sites, and I'm using it fairly loosely, have more than 40 species within a few hectares, which is about a third of our total national fauna. You'd never find anything remotely like that in the countries of the Mediterranean. Now, we can account for that in part because we know that lots of species in areas that were not glaciated had species split into a lot of small areas, and within each they developed sufficient differences that people now call them different species. But when we look at these replacing species, that raises the question, are they actually all the same kind? They're merely a slight variance on one form of snail, occupying a very limited geographical area, move to the next mountain, and you've got exactly the same kind of snail, but it's reckoned to be a different species. And this seems to me to be quite an important point to consider. Now, for Hutchinson, writing a long time ago, species where synonymous with kind. And what we find when we look at tropical and Mediterranean and other areas where there have been climatic shifts in sea level, volcanism and whatnot, is that rather than complete extinction, ranges expand and contract. And when they contract, you have the opportunity for the same kind of snail to develop just sufficient differences for it to be regarded as a new species, as another species. And this is work I did a very long time ago in Western Australia, where there are faunas running along a limestone ridge which stretches for about 160, 170 kilometers. And you find that particularly the big caminid snails, which look roughly like our helicoid snails, every few kilometers, sometimes less, the species changes. And the work done on this is very thorough, it's perfectly convincing. And in fact, there are, in this case, 2 caminid species, usually, in each place. And particularly in the north, where you've got an Amplyragida and a Westraltrachea, when you look at their shells, you have to look jolly closely to tell them apart. They're roughly the same size, they're roughly the same shape, they're mostly white-shelled things like that particular Amplyragida. And so if there's 22 species, how many kinds are there? And if you've got 2 living together, maybe there's just 2 kinds with the species replacing them. Well, have we got any evidence for that? Yes. Look at the radula of those two genera of snails living in the same place. Amplyragida is clearly one that's grinding stuff off like lichens and bacterial films off rocks. But you look at that Westraltrachea, I bet it's got some animals in its diet with a radula like that. So there are definitely 2 kinds, but 22 species may be exaggerating it a bit. And there are plenty of other examples over the world of spectacular radiations of very similar species. And the classic one of the most impressive, is of the Clausiliid albinaria in Greece and Western Turkey. And Eddie Gittenberger, famous Dutch malacologist, coined the phrase non-adaptive radiation for this. And what he meant was not that they weren't adapted to their environment, but they were all essentially adapted to the same environment. And you move from one hill to another or one island to another, and the species change. Now, that begins to put what's going on in Greece into a kind of perspective. Have they really got more kinds of species than we have in Britain? It's an interesting question. And at the other extreme, what was always held up to be classically convergent evolution and ecological equivalence, where you find very distantly related snails which look completely identical, or nearly so. So I put there a polygyrid from North America with our Isognomostoma from Europe, and they have very similar apertural barriers, very similar patterns of of shell growth and live in very much the same kinds of places. Has evolution caused different things to come to resemble one another? And that again raises the question, we're drawing a distinction between kind, perhaps what the snail is doing, and what its official taxonomic rank is. Now, let's go into a bit more detail. Here is the geographical distribution of an animal which is not a mollusk. Can anybody guess which species I'm talking about?
Yes.
Bang on. And the point about that is that obviously, you cannot easily define a niche, and it doesn't tend to stay constant. And when we look at the range of ecological and geographical ranges of snails, some are very restricted, some have got very broad geographical ranges. Nothing as big as humans, and it's worth making the point that with the exception of a few islands, that pattern of human distribution isn't due to modern technology. It's been there for thousands of years. And it shows that a species can be adaptable and adapt to a huge range of environmental constraints. So let's look at some examples. Here's our own humble little Laurea cylindrosa, common species. Now, it's said, if you look at all the guidebooks, including my own, it's a species of rocks and walls covered with plants, and you find it in forests. I found this in dry grassland of the Macaire and in the Outer Hebrides. I found it in the middle of a fen in the Shetlands. It occurs on the rocky, barren hillsides of Lago de Fogo in the Azores, and it's in my favourite hotspot locally, Anstonstones Wood near Sheffield. It's the range of habitats it can occupy is actually very wide. It does seem to be limited by climate. If you look at the map of the distribution of Laurea, it doesn't like places that get very cold in winter. So it gets just into the Baltic and the island of Rügen, but beyond that, it's then got too cold, particularly away from the sea, and you don't find it. But often, particularly in the Azores, you can find more than one species of Laurea living side by side. This one and some endemic ones. Question, are they different kinds? You can look at them. Nobody studied their diets or even their radulae. There's no reason to think that one is replacing the other. It appears to be a perfectly stable combination. What about climate? Here is the master snail of the Northwest Palearctic, Coccodina laminata. It does seem, generally, it is agreed that it's a forest species. Its present range must have been reached since the last glaciation, because most of the areas it inhabited, it now inhabits, were either under ice or were tundra or steppe, neither of which are suitable. And I put there the temperature regimes at the extreme west and the extreme east of its range. So that's Sligo and Chelyabinsk at the southern end of the Ural Mountains. This snail can stand everything from extreme Atlantic to extreme continental. And when you consider that it can only have reached these places within the last possibly 10,000, possibly less years, it shows a quite remarkable degree of adaptability, whether it's by natural selection or climate or an ability to adjust internally to different climates. But now there are a whole host of other Cotyledonous species in Europe. And most of them have much narrower geographical ranges. And yet they look basically very similar. Why has one kind got this immense adaptability and all the others seem to be stuck in little geographical black holes, as it were? They haven't spread very much. There are a few that have spread a bit more, but nothing like as dramatic as Cotyledonous laminatum. So it immediately raises the question, you've got a whole lot of snails that look superficially very similar to one another, but one has really swept the board and colonized the whole of northern Europe. The others sort of stuck in comparatively small areas. Why? Now, when we look into it, the same species, never mind kinds, can be adaptable to climate, but apparently not all of them, as I've just pointed out. Why not? So, some examples. The only consistent restriction, which is due to work by two French workers a long time ago now, is that in below freezing conditions, snails survive by supercooling. That is to say, their tissues don't freeze. And the way they do that is quite physiologically complicated, but it is much more difficult to protect yourself if you are large, because it only takes a single ice crystal to start somewhere, and then suddenly, woof, everything freezes. If you're below the freezing temperature of your body, your osmotic concentration is not really relevant here. You do need special mechanisms. But beyond that, if you look at the big species, I put two up there, the upper and lower lethal temperatures of different populations differ. What I'm getting at is that the boundaries of a niche in terms of food or temperature or whatnot are not fixed in concrete, as it were. They vary. And we don't know whether this adjustment is due to acclimatization or whether there is indeed a proper genetic difference between Theba pisana from, say, Israel and Theba pisana, let's say, from Tenby. We just don't know that. But we do know that they can stand different degrees of cold. It gets worse when you're trying to think about kinds and species. I gave you that range of Cotyledonous laminatum. It's only one of many, many clausiliid species in Europe. But most of them have very restricted ranges. Furthermore, you can find up to 10 species living in the same 400 square meter quadrant. This is in the Carpathians. In Britain, we're lucky if we find 3 in one wood. Whether that reflects the difference in the niches available, or it simply depends on what managed to get here after the Ice Age, is an open question. We'll come back to those clausilids in a little bit. But when you look at the fauna of North America, north of anywhere, north of most of Europe, not only are there no clausilids, there is nothing like them. But yet, if I took you into a limestone gorge in Iowa, you would see the same genera of trees as you see in the White Peak in Derbyshire. Oak, ash, beech. You unless you were paying close attention, you wouldn't know which wood you were in. And yet there are no clausilids or anything like them in those places. Now, we can accept, I think, that right, there are no clausiliids in North America simply because they never managed to get dispersal matters. So, but surely, if there was a niche for being tall and thin, something else would have evolved to fill it. And it doesn't appear to have happened. And it's, again, it raises a different question about even when you look at that shape of shell and you think it must have some kind of ecological importance, it doesn't become clear what it is. And I once thought when I first looked at the fauna of bits of North America that they were genuinely niches unfilled. But they were unfilled because the right ancestor had not managed to get there. Now I'm not so sure. One sort of thought that, clausiliids must have a particular niche. That niche should be available just as much in North America as in Europe. The range of climate is no greater than that between Sligo and Cheliabinsky. What's going on here? Why isn't that kind of snail present? And it means we have to start looking at the shell. Now, a long time ago, there was a very bright paleontologist called David Rauch who worked out that you could describe coiled shells with some very simple mathematical rules. And he produced a model which shows you how you can change from one shape of shell to another by very simple alterations in the process of growing, whether how much the world is descending, how much it's expanding as it goes round. But one of the interesting things about it is he could show that there was a huge range of potential morphological space which could be occupied by spiral shells, but in actual fact, a very limited bit of it was occupied. And that tells us that there's some good mechanical reasons why you don't get certain shapes of shell. You can imagine something that starts off very big and gets smaller and smaller as it goes down, and it doesn't appear to be sensible. And indeed, we don't find snails of that sort around. Now, the problem with the shell is that, well, it's the obvious thing we look at. I know there are some slug experts here who may have a slightly different take on this, but we look at the shape of the shell, and by comparison with other groups of animals, I can tell the difference. There's a leopard skeleton is different from a horse skeleton, and we know it's because one's a herbivore and one's a carnivore, and all sorts of things follow from that. So surely we ought to be able to tell from the shape of the shell and its size, sort of give us an idea about what kind of snail it is and what it's doing. And there are mechanical properties of different shapes of shell, which are indeed of some importance. Again, I produced that diagram on the left a long time ago. Look at it carefully. Shell height is going up and shell width is going along, and it's logarithmic. And what I put there is the Western European fauna as it was known about 25 years ago. I don't think it changed very much. And you will see that there is a very distinct pattern. Shells are either taller than they are wide or wider than they are tall. There are rather few that are the same. There are some, but there are rather a few. And if I point out the blue ones on the left are all the clausiliids. The green ones are all the helicoids, that's to say hygromiids and helicidae. And the black ones are Zonicidae sensulata very much. Includes now a lot of families as they've been split. And you can see what that message tells you is that because classification is not usually based only on the shell, it tells you that snails that are closely related to one another tend to look like one another because of that, because of their ancestry. And it's what's called phylogenetic constraint. And I should add that it's not only the shape of the shell, but the number of tightness of the coiling. And I've put an example there. Discus rhodopedatus. If you blew it up to the same size as Helix pomatia with that same shell shape, when it was hanging off a branch or a stone, it would be having 4 times as much of a load trying to pull it off due to gravity as would Helix pomatia. So they're obvious, and it's perfectly true that no very big snails are tightly coiled. There are good mechanical reasons why that is so. There are also good reasons why very tall snails, like the clausiliids, don't get as big as globular or acatinoid species. I put there a photograph of the biggest known clausiliid, thanks to Anna Drost from Łódź in Poland. The specimen comes from, the species lives in Vietnam, where there are a big radiation of clausiliids, and this is the biggest known. So it's 40 millimeters tall, which is quite going some. But it weighs about 1,700 milligrams. Now, Helix pomatia weighs about 23,000, if I remember rightly. And actually, it's far smaller than any of the larger, more globular species. And being tightly coiled is a bad idea from those 2 examples if you want to be big. And I put here similar scatter diagrams for different islands, New Zealand at the bottom, and then Tristan da Cunha, Hawaii, Samoa, Galapagos. And although the patterns differ quite a lot, we can ask the question, is this because the range of niches is different? Which the answer probably is, I suspect. But is that all? And I don't think it is. I think we've got some snails constrained by what their ancestor looked like. They will adapt to different ways of life, but within the evolutionary time span involved, they haven't necessarily got the optimum shell shape for their niche. And just to illustrate how you can get plunged into detail, here is an analysis again by Anna George from Łódź of coexisting clausiliid species in the Carpathian. And what you can see without going is that there is a suite of species on the left, which you regularly find in all the forests and swamps. There is a group in the middle, which you tend to find in beech forests, much drier. And then there are some odds and ends on the extreme right, which don't show any very clear pattern. But in every case where there's an asterisk, it means there is a significant absence or presence of the species concerned. So you ask me why can 10 species coexist in the Carpathians? The answer is some of them have different niches. And probably those of you who are familiar with clausiliids are used to the idea of finding them on vertical surfaces, rocks or tree trunks, or clinging to the side of a fallen log. Some species are regularly found much more often in the leaf litter, even though they've got the same shell shape, and you wonder why. So again, it just illustrates that boundary between kinds and species is kind of a little bit hazy. Now, so it raises the question in my mind, to what extent are shell characters a reliable guide to way of life, or to niche, to kinds? And if the answer is not much, and I've been sort of suggesting that that might be the case, the follow-up is why not? And the answer, which I gave you the technical term already, phylogenetic constraint. That is to say, if your ancestors are a particular size and shape, it takes a lot of evolution to shift you into something different in terms of the shell. And we may not have any idea why. And just, I am very much an ardent believer in the power and strength of natural selection. Not too surprising when I tell you that I was a pupil of the late Arthur Kane, who was accused by others of being a naive pan-selectionist who thought it could explain everything. I don't go quite that far, but just I am suspicious of anybody who uses, when you're bound by your ancestors, as an excuse for explaining something. And because after all, when you think about it, Arthur Kane and Helix Pomatia had the same common ancestor. It needed a few hundreds of millions of years to make the distinction, but it's there. So I'm suspicious about people using a nice convenient term like phylogenetic constraint to explain why things don't quite fit. And I want to end up by looking at some particular cases. Now, here are these famous clausiliids, and I keep on coming back to them. And I keep on thanking Anna Job, because she has stud bred and been breeding clausiliids from all over their range, which is basically European and Middle Eastern, then again in Southeast Asia, then again in South America. So there are three separate I should say there's a separate radiation in the Caucasus, where there are lots and lots of species of clausiliids, none of which we recognize as being present in the rest of Europe. So there's a great range of size there, but once it looks like once a clausiliid, always a clausiliid. And you can recognize them regardless of their size, almost on sight. Yes, that's a clausiliid. It's a kind in a higher social order. But here's a sample of streptaxoids, kindly given me by Ben, and not much sign of phylogenetic constraint within that little lot, is there? Almost any conceivable shell shape. These species are not to scale, but as far as shell shape goes, anything goes. Now, why is there this difference? After all, in North America, things could evolve into a clausiliid shape. There's something strange going on here. Oops, I think I may have. Now, here's I think I skipped past one, but
you can go back when you're that arrow.
How do I go back? Because this is your keyboard is not like mine.
Yeah, that's back.
Oh, that's back. Maybe a slide's got missed, but okay, now it won't go forward. I did the cheap trick. With Photoshop, you can alter the dimensions of your image. And so I simply stretched or flattened the original image I'd got. And so you can see the selection there. There's Sapir, there's a strophocylid species I was given from South America. There's Copricella, Helix Pomatia, even Discus ruderatus. And when you mess about with the geometry, you very easily get perfectly plausible shapes, yes? I mean, you can see things which look like a Sicilioides or whatnot, and you get some perfectly reasonable shapes. And so there doesn't seem to be any obvious barrier to changing. When you try it with Clausilians, you end up with an absolute monster. I mean, you might just plausibly have got something, the second one from the left, but go beyond that and you've got something really bizarre. And we don't find them. And it suggests to me that once you've gone down some pathways, it's more difficult to get back out again than if you have a fairly basic shape to start with. Now, I asked Ben what he thought the ancestral streptaxoid looked like, and I had to press him quite hard. He didn't admit himself at all. But in the end, he did eventually come up with an answer. I suspect, notice I'm not that the most parsimonious option is a shape typical of most other Achatininae, a conical shell larger than wide with about 5 whorls. Just think of the classic African giant African snail. You've more or less got there. And from that kind of origin, you can go almost anywhere with the shell shapes. And what I find fascinating is working with Polish colleagues. They have found some of the earliest known land mollusks as fossils at the Carboniferous Permian boundary. And these snails, judging by the fact that they've got teeth in the mouth, are almost certainly eupulmonates. They didn't have an operculum. So we're looking at pretty near to ancestral forms. And they are either a catinoid, 4 or 5 whorls, or globular. And no fancy shapes. And I think that the origin of most of our morphological diversity comes from this kind of ancestor. And the change can happen quite fast. Here are 2 Leptaxis species from the Azores. Both occur on Santa Maria. And Leptaxis Sancta Mariae, which looks like an Ena, it was originally put in a separate genus, Helixina. In fact, it's very closely related to the one above. In fact, some of the other Leptaxis, which all look much like the top one, are further apart from one another in evolutionary history than these 2 are to each other. So the Azores has only been around for 1 million or 2 million years at most. So you can go from one to the other for whatever reason, and that I have no idea, quite quickly. I'm going to end with 2 examples. All the species shown there are carnivores. You can tell they're carnivores, apart from studying their actual feeding habits, you can look at their radulae. And the radulae have a lot in common. It's a question, do we think of carnivorous snails as a kind? Because if so, the morphological and taxonomic diversity is colossal. Equally, here are 2 snails, very similar in shape and size. A stropicylid I'm linked to was given to me a long time ago by somebody who didn't know what it was, but knew where it came from. And that he gave me the shell and 2 eggs. There is an egg of that stropicylid. And in fact, the other egg broke, and there was the remains of a developing embryo in it. developing embryo was about the size of, let's say, Hygrogia striolata, sorry, Trocula striolatus. It was huge. And as opposed to Lusacatina fulica, the notorious pest snail, they're both the same size, they have a very similar shape, but whereas the Stropicalid is now threatened, it's very much K-selected, it's laying very few eggs with an awful lot of resources put into each, as opposed to Lusacatina, which can lay more than 1,000 eggs in its lifetime. And clearly, on shell shape is not telling you anything much about what kind of snail they are. They've got very different ways of life. Now, I'm not claiming that size and shape don't matter. They do. But, and in particular geographical areas, it probably makes quite a lot of sense simply to equate species with kinds. And it worked when I looked with Greek colleagues at the Aegean Islands. That worked because instead of plotting up differences in number of species, you looked at differences in the number of morphotypes. And that actually showed you that even though the species were different, the formal composition looked at from that point of view was much the same on each island of the same size. So, I mean, we struggle to get comprehensive details of anything other than the shell. I mean, the shell is easy because you've got it. It can be dead. But even preparing the radula is quite hard work. And it's not been done for enough species for us to start looking at that aspect of their niche. Now, I've actually not referred back directly to the idea of competition. I don't know whether it's important. Some defiantly say it's of no importance at all. I'm not sure. I hope as a result of this talk, you're not sure either, because it is, I think, an unresolved question. Now, just to end up with, because he's one of my favourite guys, I hope you will have noticed that I've raised the question and completely failed to answer. Because I don't think at the moment we're in a position to answer it with any degree of precision. And I can only repeat the apology given by Sir Thomas Browne, famous doctor and writer in the reign of Charles II, at the end of his eccentric account of what we would now call urban myths, pseudodoxia epidemica, in other words, false ideas that went rushing around. And I will read it because it takes a bit of getting used to. Thus we have at last drawn our conjectures onto a period, wherein if our contemplations afford no satisfaction unto others, I hope our attempts will bring no condemnation on ourselves. For though in this long journey we miss the intended end, yet are many things of truth disclosed by the way, and to this collateral verity may unto reasonable speculation somewhat requite the capital in discovery. Thank you.